Good morning to you once again. Now into our business update this morning. Everyone has been doing a post-budget analysis of Uganda's budget reading that we had by Matia Kasaija, who's the Minister for Finance, Planning and Development here in Uganda on the 14th of June. But of course, also on the East African level, you did have East African countries coming together and also giving their budget readings on the same day, except for Kenya, a resolution that was came down to back in 2007. Now, as an effort to actually achieve this regional economic growth that we are looking forward to, especially for the financial year 2022 into 2023, countries in the East African region have agreed on a common budget theme. And this theme is accelerating economic recovery as well as enhancing productive sectors for improved livelihood. Now, here to give us a business update in this regard is Miss Grace, who's a tax specialist with SEATINI, and she's going to be giving us a picture of the question: will the East African community budgets actually spur up economic growth? Good morning to you, Grace.
Good morning, Regina.
And how are you?
Fine, thank you. How are you?
Okay, so briefly share with us some of the various tax measures in Uganda and also in the East African community for the financial year 2022-2023, and what's going to be their implication on regional integration and growth.
Broadly, what we've seen when it comes to the East African region with the measures that have been put in place, we see that most of the countries have mainly centered around ensuring that they're aligning some of the measures that were in place, trying to see that they are more clearer, but also looking at it in terms of administration, that it's easier. There have not been very many new tax rates, but what we are also looking out for is how far or how much they've achieved in terms of moving towards harmonization. So we see that we've made quite some strides when it comes to the CET, that's the Common External Tariff, that looks at import duties imposed on commodities that are coming from outside the East African region. So we've seen a fourth band being introduced approved of 35%. And we think that is definitely going to spur in terms of ensuring that there is more trade going on within the region, as well as protecting especially the domestic industries within the East African region.
Okay, all right. I know that you had recently, this week, you did have a post-budget tax and a budget review of not just Uganda, but also all of East Africa, and you had representation in that regard from the different member states. One of the things that was addressed is the Africa Continental Trade-Free Area. Now, tell us more about that and what its impact could be in regional integration of trade.
So the African Continental Free Trade Area is it's an arrangement that was agreed on by member states within the African Union. So at the moment, about 54 out of 55 member states within the EAC have been able to sign up for it. In the EAC, only South Sudan has not yet ratified. And ratification meaning that we're putting in place measures where we're trying to speak to some of the requirements within the African Continental Free Trade Area. And when it comes to trade within the EAC, we see it's a good opportunity, especially in terms of creating market for goods, because it is and will be the biggest free trade area across the globe. So that is definitely a very big opportunity. However, what we see, especially in terms of domestic revenue, that there are quite a number of countries that would stand to lose revenue, because if you have countries foregoing import duties, much as there is an increment in trade, we're not yet sure of whether this gap will be filled. So I think there's also need to look deeply into that and ensure that while we have all this trade going on, the gap in terms of revenue that we lose as African countries will be filled. Yeah.
Okay, all right. And then in terms of revenue collection to be able to then feed into this regional integration, what, in your capacity, what is the response to the revenue collectors or the revenue authorities in the member states of the East African community?
The response would be, since of course the CAFTA will definitely cost us in terms of import duties, but we've previously seen different avenues or different loopholes that have allowed for countries, especially within the East African region, to lose out when it comes to revenue. And one of the reasons why the EAC has often emphasized tax harmonization is to sort of close some of these gaps. We've seen numerous tax incentives and exemptions within the EAC where we are almost racing to the bottom because everyone wants to attract investors, so everyone keeps trying to impose the lowest tax rates. We've seen loopholes within some of our domestic, double taxation agreements. These are agreements that are often signed by countries to avoid double taxation, but in the end it results into no taxation at all because companies take advantage and avoid paying or even evade paying their fair share of taxes. We also see revenue leakages broadly when it comes to, even within some of our tax laws, that companies are using creative accounting methods to avoid paying their fair share of taxes. So for us, we feel these are some of those that need to be looked at and addressed by governments, especially to see to it that we are maximizing revenue from the other sources if we stand to lose when it comes to the import duties.
Okay, all right. Now, of course, in the East African community, you do have 7 countries. You do have Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, as well as the new entrant DRC. Now, that brings into the question of mobilization, allocation, as well as utilization of public resources. In terms of transparency and accountability, how do you think we can heighten transparency and accountability of the 7 member states to be able to then achieve what we are calling as accelerating economic recovery and positive, productive sectors being improved?
I think that then would call for us to continuously appreciate the link between tax and development, where we see that tax not only provides revenue, but also provides requires that when the money is collected, it is redistributed and that everyone is able to benefit, because that then means that if we have the revenue redistributed and everyone is benefiting, you're also bridging the inequality gap, and that means you'll eventually be able to actually raise more revenue. But looking also at where the money is being invested, we need to see more revenue being invested in the productive sectors, agriculture, trade, industry, so that you then have that vicious cycle where if these sectors are growing, then they're definitely able to raise more revenue. And when they raise more revenue, then it means even us as a country will benefit. So it goes back to that whole cycle. In terms of accountability, of course, we look at citizens' engagement, how much are governments actually involving citizens in these processes. And in your assessment, for the last financial year, what has been the citizens' engagement in this process? Broadly, if I look at it in terms of, because we have the expenditure side and the revenue side of the budget, so over the years we've definitely seen a more clear process when it comes to the expenditure side. Ministry of Finance going out to the local governments, getting views of the people. However, when it comes to the revenue side, it has been a bit closed in. We get to access some of those spaces and present some of our proposals as CSOs. But I think this year it was also a bit closed in when it came to Parliament, especially in terms of who was able to get there. Much as they called for people to submit, yes, they submitted, but in terms of actually getting to hear the voices of the people, talking about some of the measures in place and whether they are suitable to their needs, that wasn't very clear. And what we've also always called upon government is to have a structured guide for citizens' engagement, especially when it comes to tax processes, because then they appreciate more. But also looking at it in terms of accountability. We know that government is raising resources and probably running different projects or programs. But the challenge is that we don't really get to see how much of the tax revenue has been used for what. They'll broadly say that we had a certain amount of money, say, directed to health. But it would also be good to know that we've collected so much tax and so much of it has been used maybe to construct a road, maybe to build a certain hospital, and that doesn't seem to come out clear.
Evidently.
And because that doesn't seem to be paid a lot of attention to, we then see quite a lot of corruption. Because if citizens knew, then many of them would be able to follow up and actually
and would be interested to follow up. Then therefore they'll be interested to participate in the forthcoming financial year budgeting. Yes,
so if that doesn't happen and if those gaps remain, then it's definitely not good when it comes to transparency and accountability for the revenue.
Okay, you have mentioned about the structure guidelines that can be implemented by the different individual governments to be able to then attract participation of citizenship. What would be some of the embedments in such a structured guideline?
Just like we have the budget process where government actually goes down, the expenditure arm side, where government actually goes down to gather views from the people and identify priorities to feed into the expenditure framework. It would also be ideal for government to actually reach out down to the citizens and understand some of the challenges that they face when it comes to taxation. I know URA has been trying to engage a lot, especially with the private sector, in terms of understanding the challenges. But if you go down at that level, right from the time when the measures are being developed, especially by the Ministry of Finance, then that would also help a lot in terms of understanding the challenges that people go through, right from paying their taxes, but also in terms of the items or what government is choosing to tax. Is it the best alternative? Is everyone paying? Because you need to understand better the context before we have some of the measures put in place. Then it would be also ideal when, after the bills have been presented to Parliament, to provide ample time, because I think this year we had about 2 weeks. That is not enough for a whole population to actually reach out to their different members of Parliament. We're also not sure of whether members of Parliament were actually able to go out within their different constituencies and consult on some of these bills before they were passed in Parliament. We didn't really see that happening. So that structured engagement where you have citizens know that this is actually happening at this particular period of time and our voices need to be heard in this space would be very key.
I guess then this makes sense for you that is watching. The whole OTT would be the best example. Yes. When it was presented, it was passed because on the brim, it looked perfect and it looked like an easy source of income and revenue for the government through URA. But 2 years down the road, URA had issues of collection, but more so if they had come down to realize and study, you know, they would have understood that there's loopholes in it because people would then go to what is known as the VPNs. That then became very popular because of that, and so it had to be scrapped off simply because of that non-structured engagement between the citizen and the collectors, the authorities, as well as the governments, which then affects the acceleration of economic recovery. Now, away from that, the current state of the play of domestic revenue mobilization in the East African community. Let's talk about that.
Broadly looking at the current state of play, of course, we see government setting targets year in, year out. We have the tax to GDP ratio within the East African region that has remained low, way below the 25% that had been set as a potential for countries within the EAC and Sub-Saharan Africa. So countries within the EAC
so
have
are you
remained...
trying to say that the pride we have in our GDP having gone up by 10
the tax,
to 35%?
No, I'm talking about the tax to GDP ratio, where you're looking at the contribution, like in terms of the contribution of the GDP to the tax collection. That has remained really low, and despite the fact that countries might register increment in revenue collected, we see that many of them do not really hit their targets, and that is also the same in Uganda. That year in, year out, we have revenues increasing, but the country is not actually hitting it. The URA is not actually hitting its target. And like I described earlier, we have quite a number of loopholes or gaps or room for leakage, where we tend to lose a lot of revenue. And
what are some of those loopholes and gaps that are imminent?
I talked about the tax incentives and exemptions. I talked about the double taxation agreements that allow for loss of revenue. I also talked about tax avoidance and evasion, because these two definitely allow for tax avoidance and evasion. And generally that whole appreciation of where people do not really feel the need to pay their taxes, so they sort of sit back and wait to be chased, which is not very good. The large informal sector, yes.
Okay, all right. So what can be done to actually promote the equitable and fair taxation across the East African region?
We've been calling for tax harmonization as one of those that would definitely allow for, that would sort of close this gap, because we see when it comes, for instance, to investment, investors want to go to those places where they do not have to pay taxes, or where they have to pay as less as possible. So what we've called for is tax harmonization across the region, so that we have equitable, so that we have similar tax rates that prevents smuggling. It also prevents the rest to the bottom, and ensures that countries are actually having healthy collections. We've often called for renegotiation of double taxation agreements to ensure that the loopholes therein are closed and companies are not taking advantage. And we know Uganda is renegotiating its treaties with Netherlands and Mauritius. We hope that it will definitely be able to protect its taxing rights. We also have a tax expenditure governance framework. Uganda, Rwanda, and Kenya have started on that process. Uganda is currently developing there's a draft that was released last year in December. We hope that that can be fast-tracked, so that we have clear guidelines in terms of who benefits and how Uganda can actually measure how much it is gaining from some of these tax incentives and exemptions. But also generally building that whole appreciation among the citizens on why they should be paying tax, and why they should be interested, is very, very critical, because you're not going to tax a population that is not willing to pay. But also one major thing as well is striking a balance between revenue collection and economic growth, or ensuring that people are actually growing in the economy, so that you're taxing a healthy population and not taxing a population that is already starving. That is also very critical.
Okay, all right. And also in regards to the different budgets that were presented across the East African region, are there future considerations of policies that can then help us absorb the shock that we have received in just this financial year past economically?
I think broadly, if you also look at some of the budgets within the EAC, they've tried to sort of provide some programs where you'll have citizens actually trying to pick up or recover from some of the effects of the COVID pandemic. Uganda, we have the parish development model. Hopefully, if it is implemented very well, then we'll definitely see an improvement in terms of the livelihoods of the people. We also see some resources being directed towards agriculture, towards trade. Although these are not very sufficient, in our opinion, we feel, okay, yes, it's a step towards ensuring that, you know, people are actually being helped to improve and recover from the pandemic.
Okay, all right. And also in terms of the tax harmonization that you're calling for across the region, would it require maybe an East African community currency? Because if you're looking at the strengths of the currencies, independent with the individual countries, they definitely challenge or will be challenged by the desire of a regional tax harmonization.
The issue of the currency is one of those aspects that was looked at when it under the regional integration process as one of those that